Welcome back. You're watching World Talks, and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte told reporters after the NATO defense ministers meeting today was the historic, and the summit will also be historic. The alliance's defense ministers agreed on Thursday to significantly increase air defenses and land forces to fend off Russia. At the same time, the meeting of German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Donald Trump took place and covered a broad range of transatlantic issues, including defense and security, trade, and Russia's war in Ukraine. Joining me now to break it all down is Reuben F. Johnson, research fellow at the Pulaski Foundation. Thank you for joining in the program.
Thank you for having me.
So, what would you say, biggest takeaways from the NATO meeting that just took place? What were the key elements of the NATO's new defense investment plan?
Well, I was just in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue Asia-Pacific Security Conference. And it's amazing to me how much of what happens in Europe now is being discussed at a security forum in Asia. This is not a European audience, these are not European countries, but yet it's at the top of the agenda. And the Swedish defense minister, Paul Johnson, he said it best with regard to your question, is he says, we in Europe have been sitting here for a long time, and people have been warning us about Russia, and we keep hitting the snooze button. And now it's time to stop that. And that, number one, is the biggest takeaway, that you hear more and more countries about going from the NATO 2% to 2.5% to 3%. Of course, Poland is, best in class when it comes to that, because you're up above 4% and probably will go above 5%. Eventually.
It goes with the understanding of the risk.
Yeah, but it's so that's one thing I would say. The second aspect of it is how nations like the United Kingdom, which is not in the EU, but it's still a NATO member, looking at their recent strategic defense review, what comes out of that, and how they say, our army is way too small. And then, thirdly, this is a sea change now. We're going back to a place we haven't been in more than 80 years, which is we now have to adopt a whole of society approach to defense. I mean, we used to say during the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and then the subsequent 20 years we spent there, we used to say the American military is at war, but Americans are at the mall. The public isn't really concerned. This is now going to have to very much change, and I think those are the three big takeaways that I get from this conference.
We've seen that NATO ministers agreed to significantly increase air defense and land forces, as I mentioned, to fend off Russia. In practical terms, what does this mean? What's going to change?
Well, air defense is a huge problem and has been since day one of the Ukraine war. And the biggest problem is there's not enough of it. And there's not enough of it because we've been at very, very low levels of production for many systems, not just the famous U.S. Patriot system, of which there are only 6 in Ukraine right now, 3 from the U.S. and the other 3 from other NATO countries, supposed to be a 7th one coming. But they probably need more like 16, more like 20. And it takes tremendous amounts of time to build these. And in the case of some lower range or lower altitude, shorter range systems, like the German system, the IRIS-T, it's built in a very, very small city with a very, very small population. And in order for that production to be spun up, you'd actually have to move to a larger metropolitan area, someplace near Berlin or something. So these are all great ambitions to have. It's very aspirational, as they would say, but it's going to take tremendous amounts of resources, and some very, very dramatic decisions will have to be made to expand production.
We've heard from U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who said on Thursday that he's confident that the members of NATO alliance would actually sign up to Donald Trump's demand for a major boost in defense. And major, I think, is a key word here. Do you think that the members have the means to do it unilaterally to get to a certain level? Because what used to be the ceiling happens to be somewhere around the floor level right now.
Yeah, everyone is going to have to increase defense spending, and that's going to mean some very, very difficult decisions. And that really comes down to, if you're looking out into the future, what technologies do you think you're really going to need? And, we used to live in this world where we built up a military establishment and we thought, well, that's going to work anywhere in the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, in South, wherever. And now we've reached a point where a lot of what you need in the European theater, if you're worried about Russia, there's not a lot of overlap with what you need in the Asian theater if you're going up against China. And there will have to be trade-offs made. People will have to make decisions about what systems and technologies they're going to invest in that will have a payoff in several years.
How important is the pledge made by NATO, additional 20 billion euros to Ukraine this year? And what role does it play in Europe's and NATO's broader security strategy?
Well, a lot of these, I keep saying this to people for a long time now, when you see these numbers, the numbers are eye-watering, 20 billion here, 10 billion there.
Indeed.
Okay, that sounds great, but let's take the United States, for example. When we say we're sending X hundred million or X billion dollars worth of military aid to Ukraine, what does that really mean? It means we're taking hardware off the shelf, out of stocks that we've already produced, and it gets sent to Ukraine. And then that money actually never gets to Ukraine, a lot of it. It just stays in America. It stays in America to build new hardware to replace the stocks that have been sent to Ukraine already. So what are we doing? We're giving ourselves more money. We're paying for American workers to work extra shifts on production lines to build more Javelins or more MSC Patriot air defense system missiles or build F-16, whatever it is. But
it does make a difference on the battlefield.
Oh, it makes a huge difference on the battlefield. But the reason I bring this up is that people keep saying, why are we sending all this money, written in inverted commas, to Ukraine? It's not going to Ukraine. It's going to American and NATO nation defense companies to build more hardware.
I think this is particularly important for people over in the United States as well, because I feel like there was a lot of a discussion when it comes to that. So let's jump into the meeting of Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who visited Donald Trump. They had a meeting in the Oval Office. How important would you say this meeting was? Was it just business as usual because that was the first trip by Mr. Merz to the Oval Office, to Washington, or there was something underneath it as well, something more that meets the eye?
Not business as usual, but obviously this is a new German government, and they have a different orientation than the previous one in numerous respects. And I think it's Trump trying to get acquainted with all of the people he's going to have to be dealing with for the rest of his term. He had this meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister Carney after all of the disputes and all of the very, very unhelpful dialogue between the two countries about America taking Canada and so on and so on. But once they sat down to talk, they actually established a kind of a dialogue. I think pretty much the same with Merz, but there is always the issue hanging over, the German question about where are their sentiments with regard to Russia? Do they still dream about going back to a situation where Russia's a partner and one of their biggest trading partners, or have they figured out yet that Russia, that great Russian cheap gas, is just never coming back?
Well, I mean, there was a discussion around Nord Stream 2 between Donald Trump, who said, you remember during my first term, I did put the sanctions on the project, and Mr. Merz seemed to point in a direction of actually admitting it was a mistake after all.
Yeah, because, I mean, that was one of the three legs that the entire German economy rested on at the time. It was this cheap Russian gas coming for forever and ever and ever. And I think people in this country, rightfully so, made the historical analogy. They called the Nord Stream 2 agreement, they called it this generation's Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is what it was essentially doing, allowing the Russians to bypass Poland and Ukraine and ship gas directly to Germany. But Nord Stream 2 is never coming back. I mean, it's a moot question now. I can't see that project ever being revived for political reasons as well as for physical, technical ones as well.
So let's focus on another point that was made. We've had some past skepticism from President Trump in regards to NATO. How should we interpret his reaffirmation that he is going to keep the U.S. forces on German soil?
He's always looking for something to prove that he's been able to get a better deal out of whatever arrangements we've had in the past. So
after all, he's a businessman.
Is he? But everything's transactional. Yes. So his, the friendly defense of Trump is that he's not trying to break up NATO. He's trying to realign it. He's trying to make it a new arrangement in which the Europeans pay for more, and that the United States are not sharing a disproportionate amount of the burden, which at a time that made, particularly in the immediate post-war years, that was the only thing that made any sense. I can't see any way that the United States would ever pull its troops out of Germany completely, or any place else in Europe completely. But we have to remember, this began a long time ago. This began under Barack Obama, who said, I'm making a pivot to Asia. Well, it wasn't a pivot to Asia, it was a pivot away from Europe. I mean, the disposition in Asia didn't really change all that much. So the way Trump looks at NATO is the way he looks at about everything else. He's trying to create a different relationship than what has existed in the past. I'm not saying it's the most productive course of action, but the commitment to security in Europe by the U.S. I don't think is ever going to change.
And let's put a full stop there, and let's hope those words are actually going to materialize, and this is going to be one of the top points on the agenda. Thank you so much, Reuben F. Johnson, Research Fellow at the Pulaski Foundation. Thank you for joining me in the studio.
Thank you for having me again.
And so this would be all for now here on World Talks, but please do stay tuned. We're back in just a moment with more news and features, and we'll see you there.